When you hear about ancient religious texts, specifically Surah An-Nisa from the Quran, you probably think it's just this, I don't know, rigid collection of domestic rules about marriage and divorce and biology, right?
Yeah, I mean, most people do. It's been universally categorized as just personal family law for centuries.
Right. But what if it's actually something entirely different? Like, what if this text is actually the blueprint for a highly advanced state-run social security system? One that's literally designed to ensure no human being is ever left without sustenance.
It is a massive paradigm shift, for sure. And what we're doing today in this deep dive is unpacking the really groundbreaking Quranic socioeconomics extracted by the scholar Allama G.A. Parwez.
Yeah.
Our source material for this is a set of extensive lecture notes and translated text where Parwez systematically extracts the actual social order from Surah An-Nisa, mostly focusing on verses 11 through 14.
And we want to be incredibly clear right up front for you listening. Our mission today is to explore this text and these concepts completely impartially. We are not here to take any political or theological sides.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing one specific religious viewpoint over another or anything like that.
Right. Our goal is strictly to walk you through the fascinating socioeconomic, legal, and honestly mathematical arguments that Parwez presents in these historical lectures. We're just treating this as a textual analysis of a proposed constitutional system.
And the foundational premise of his work is that these verses are just not about religious rituals or, mere domestic checklists. He frames this whole section of the text as a universal manifesto for human rights.
A manifesto, wow.
Yeah, it's an economic charter. And to really understand it, we have to look at the mechanisms it puts in place for resource distribution, wealth decentralization, and the protection of marginalized dependents.
Which is so relevant right now. If you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by modern economic inequality or, the hoarding of generational wealth, or even just a broken backlog legal system where property disputes drag on for decades.
Oh, absolutely.
This deep dive is going to provide a stunningly rational framework for what Parwez calls dynamic equity. It just feels completely modern, like a blueprint for a resource-based economy, even though it's centuries old.
It really does read like an advanced systems engineering manual for human society. But to see that blueprint clearly, we first have to, wipe away centuries of traditional interpretations.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can look at the economic machinery, we have to fix the language, right?
Right. You can't read a constitutional charter if you're treating it like a book of poetry.
Or in this case, a rigid book of biological gender roles.
Yeah, exactly. According to the source material, traditional jurisprudence fundamentally altered the original functional meanings of the text.
Yeah.
Well, Parwez argues that historical monarchies and religious elites essentially conspired to divide human life into two spheres. You had secular public law, which the kings controlled, and sacred personal law, which the clergy controlled.
Wait, why would they want to do that? Like, what is the actual advantage of splitting the law up like that?
It comes down to control. If you are a monarch, you want absolute authority over the economy, the military, public policy. You don't want a divine text dictating how you manage the state treasury. So by convincing the public that the text only applies to the sacred private sphere, like how you pray, how you marry, how you divide your personal belongings, the kings freed themselves from the text's overarching economic constraints.
That is wild. So
Yeah.
because of this artificial split, these inheritance verses were literally downgraded from public constitutional law to just domestic personal regulations.
Exactly. And to recover the original intent, Parwez insists we must do a deep dive into the real meaning, the mafhum of key terms used in the text.
Okay, let's start with the term orphans, or yatama in Arabic.
Yeah.
Traditionally, when we hear orphan, we just think of a child who has lost their parents.
Right. It's a totally age-based biological definition. But Parwez pushes back on this entirely.
Because that doesn't fit a macroeconomic model.
No, it doesn't. The lecture notes redefine yatama functionally. He translates it as those left alone in the struggle of life.
Oh, wow. Those left alone in the struggle of life. That is a crucial semantic shift.
It is. It means the term encompasses anyone who has been left economically or socially vulnerable completely regardless of their age.
So like a widow without income or an elderly person without family support.
Exactly. Or even a marginalized community member. All of them fall under the functional category of yatama because they are left alone in life's struggle. The text is demanding a safety net for vulnerability, not just childhood.
That makes so much more sense when you're looking at building a state-run welfare system. It's strictly needs-based. And I guess that brings us to an even more debated term, women, or Nisa. Again, traditionally, this is read strictly as a biological gender.
Right.
But if we were talking about a constitutional charter, isn't it a bit, I don't know, patronizing to just label an entire biological gender as a group that universally needs state protection?
That is a very common modern critique, and Parwez's linguistic extraction really addresses it. He moves the definition away from strictly biological gender, redefining Nisa as a functional group within society that historically requires societal protection.
Societal protection and, like, a specific economic safety net.
Yeah. In the context of these socioeconomic laws, the term relates to the role women play in the survival of the species, bearing and rearing the next generation.
So it's less about saying women are inherently weak and need help, and more about acknowledging a massive, undeniable biological tax.
That is the core of it, yes. Bearing and rearing humanity places an enormous physical, developmental, and temporal burden on that specific segment of the population.
It's a massive amount of labor.
Right, so the text places them in a category requiring absolute financial shielding by the broader system, just to offset that specific societal contribution.
Okay, so if NISA are granted this absolute financial shielding, who is actually paying for it? Is the state funding this directly, or is the burden placed on someone else?
Well, this brings us to the third term, which has been wildly misunderstood for centuries,
Huh.
Qawwam. It's usually translated as provider.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And traditionalists historically use this term to assert male biological superiority or just absolute authority over women,
Essentially translating it as boss or ruler of the house.
which Parwez fiercely rejects. He strictly redefines Qawwam, referencing Surah An-Nisa verse 34, as nothing more than a legal economic liability.
A liability, not a privilege.
Exactly. It does not mean superiority. It designates the male strictly as the financial guarantor for household expenses. It is an administrative burden, a legal mandate placed upon the male to provide the sustenance for the family unit.
I want to pause here because this is a brilliant shift in perspective. Think about how the word dependent works on your tax form today.
Right. Yeah.
Being a dependent isn't a philosophical measure of a person's worth or their intelligence or their biological capability. It is strictly a functional economic category used by the state to figure out who carries a financial liability and who needs tax relief.
That is a perfect analogy. Parwez is saying these Quranic terms are exactly that. Economic categories for a state welfare system, not philosophical judgments on human worth.
So clarifying these three terms, Yatama as the vulnerable, Nisa as the protected group, and Qawwam as the financial guarantor, it just completely changes the landscape.
It does. Once you remove the biological superiority complex and replace it with functional economic liabilities, the entire engine of Surah An-Nisa begins to hum.
It transforms into what Parwez calls Nizami Rububiyat.
Yes, the system of universal nourishment.
Okay, so now that we understand the functional categories, how does the system actually protect the vulnerable? We have the definitions. But what is the primary tool of wealth distribution?
To understand the economic engine, we have to look at the concept of wasiya, which translates to the mandatory will or bequest.
The will. Okay.
And this is where the historical subversion really takes center stage in Parwez's lecture. According to the source, traditional clerical law reduced the wasiya to an optional charity.
Right. They capped it. They said you can only give away 1/3 of your estate in a will, and you are actually forbidden from using that 1/3 for your legal heirs.
Exactly.
So if you want to leave money to your own child who desperately needs it, traditional law says you can't use the will for that. It forces the wealth into a rigid automatic fractions system instead.
And the sources point out something really incredible about where this 1/3 limitation came from. It isn't in the Quran at all.
Wait, really?
Not at all. It is based entirely on a single historical anecdote, an oral tradition or hadith, about a companion named Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas.
Wait, an anecdote. What is the story?
The story goes that Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas was seriously ill and wanted to leave his entire massive estate to public welfare. And the Prophet reportedly told him, no, leave some for your family, and permitted him to will only 1/3.
Okay.
But Parwez notes that this single isolated anecdote, which was recorded roughly 250 years after the fact, was used by later jurists to completely abrogate or override the clear constitutional mandate written in the text itself.
Wait, if the original text clearly says you can give your wealth to anyone based on need, why would kings and clerics 250 years later want to cap it at 1/3 and force the rest into fixed fractions? I mean, who benefits from that?
Power and predictability. I mean, think about it. If wealth is distributed purely on localized familial need, the family unit remains perfectly balanced and economically resilient.
Right, because the money goes where the need is.
Exactly. And resilient families don't need to depend on feudal lords, monarchs, or predatory clerical systems for loans. By forcing wealth into rigid, unthinking fractions and stripping the family head of the power to allocate based on actual circumstances, you guarantee that some people inherit massive surplus wealth while others get absolutely nothing.
It creates a permanent underclass of desperate people alongside an entrenched class of wealthy elites.
And structurally, desperate people are much easier to rule.
That is a staggering realization. So what does the actual text say about the sequence of inheritance before the clerics changed it?
Parwez points out that Surah An-Nisa repeats the correct sequence of inheritance 3 separate times, and that sequence is absolute. Step 1, pay all outstanding debts.
Makes sense.
Step 2, fulfill the wasiya, the customized will. Step 3, then and only then, do you apply the fixed mathematical fractions to whatever residual wealth is left over.
So the fractions are just the backup plan.
Exactly. That sequence is the heart of the Nizam-e-Rububiyat. Parwez emphasizes that the Quran uses the authoritative term kutiba, meaning prescribed or mandated for the wasiya.
So it's not optional.
No, it is a fard, a mandatory constitutional obligation, and crucially, there is no 1/3 cap in the text.
None at all.
None. The individual has the absolute authority to allocate up to 100% of their wealth based on actual socioeconomic need, specifically to their parents and close relatives, before any automatic fractions ever kick in.
I want to map this out to make it real for the listener. How does this play out in a concrete, everyday scenario?
Sure, the lecture provides a very pragmatic socioeconomic model. Imagine a parent who has 2 dependents. The parent has already invested heavily in the older son. They funded his education abroad, supported him for years, and now that son is a prosperous, wealthy high court judge.
Okay, so he's set.
He's set. But later, the parent has a daughter or perhaps an orphan grandson whose father passed away. This second dependent is destitute, completely lacking independent economic viability.
Okay, so under the traditional modified law with the 1/3 cap, the parent's hands are basically tied.
Completely tied.
The rigid biological algorithms take over. The wealthy judge's son automatically receives a massive share, in fact, double the daughter's share. And the orphan grandson is entirely bypassed by the rigid clerical rules and gets nothing. He's legally frozen out of the grandfather's estate.
Exactly. The wealth concentrates at the top, flowing to the person who needs it least.
But under Parwez's extraction of the Nizam-e-Rububiyat, the parent uses the mandatory wasiya to assess the disparate needs of their dependents.
Right.
The parent sees the judge's son is fine, and the daughter or grandson is highly vulnerable. So the parent writes a will directing 100% of the remaining estate exclusively to the destitute daughter or the orphan grandson.
Yes, and the fixed fractions never even apply because the estate was entirely allocated via the wasiya based on real-world need.
This is a completely different universe of law. It shifts wealth distribution from these blind robotic biological algorithms to conscious dynamic equity.
It really is a localized, decentralized, micro-level social security intervention.
The parent acts as the state's distributor, preemptively neutralizing economic disparity within the family unit and preventing the concentration of surplus wealth.
Which is brilliant, because by stripping the family head of this exact power to allocate based on need, traditional law reverted society back to capitalistic wealth hoarding, ensuring the rich stay rich and the vulnerable remain destitute.
I follow the logic of the will. It's powerful. But I have to push back here because this raises a massive elephant in the room.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the wasiya is meant to handle specific needs and can encompass the whole estate, what are the famous fixed inheritance fractions actually for?
Right.
And more importantly, how do we address the 2-to-1 gender disparity? Surah An-Nisa verse 11 explicitly assigns the male twice the inheritance share of the female. I don't care how you frame it, a 2-to-1 ratio for men and women sounds like the very definition of systemic inequality.
Yeah.
How does that fit into a universal manifesto for human rights?
It is the most common critique leveled at the text, and Parwez addresses it head-on by breaking down the systemic logic. The fixed fractional distributions are strictly secondary. They apply only to the residual wealth, whatever is left over if the will didn't cover everything.
Okay.
And the default rule, assigning a male twice the share of a female, is not a statement of biological worth. It is an administrative, functional offset. Remember our semantic shift regarding the word qawwam?
Right, the male's legal liability to be the financial guarantor for the household?
Exactly. Because the male is qawwam, he bears 100% of the absolute legal liability for the family's financial expenditures. His inheritance share is heavily burdened.
He's legally mandated to spend it on the household.
Yes. The female's inheritance, however, is entirely her own surplus capital. She is legally unburdened by any household liabilities.
Let me make sure I'm getting this.
Right.
So if a brother gets $100,000 and a sister gets $50,000, the brother's $100,000 isn't really his.
No, it's not.
It is legally earmarked for rent, groceries, and the sustenance of the family unit, which includes providing for the females in his care if they need it. But the sister's $50,000 is 100% pure profit for her own independent security.
That is exactly right. The lecture notes point out that this system creates a unique economic state. Women are tasked by nature with a biologically taxing and developmentally critical role, bearing and rearing the next generation of humanity.
Right.
Because of this monumental societal contribution, the Quranic system grants women a functional economic exemption, like a handicap, from the obligation of external economic labor.
But what if the woman wants to work? What if she doesn't want to just sit back and receive a maternal allowance?
The system doesn't forbid her from working or participating in the economy at all. It just states that she is structurally exempted from the liability of providing.
Ah, I see the difference.
Yeah, if she works, she keeps 100% of her earnings. Her wealth is legally protected from the basic operational costs of the family. If the man works, his earnings are legally bound to the household.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. The 2-to-1 inheritance is a macroeconomic offset for this permanent lifetime liability placed on the male. By granting women inheritance capital without any corresponding financial liability for the household, the system is effectively issuing a state-mandated maternal and developmental allowance.
So it's macroeconomic equity, not primitive blind equality. It matches resource distribution perfectly to resource expenditure.
Exactly.
But does the text explicitly prove this is about economic liability and not just a permanent biological hierarchy? Like, does the math back that up?
It does. Parwez proves this isn't rooted in misogyny using the math of the text itself. He points out that the 2-to-1 ratio is dynamically applied only where the male economic liability is present.
Okay.
Where that specific functional burden of household finance is absent, the text dictates exact 1-to-1 mathematical equality without any gender bias whatsoever.
Okay, I need an example of that. Where does the math shift to 1-to-1?
Look at parents inheriting from a deceased child. Surah An-Nisa states that a mother and a father each receive an equal 1/6 share of the estate.
Oh, wow, so they both get a 6.
Right. The gender of the parent doesn't matter. They get the exact same fraction because the liability dynamic between them regarding that specific child's wealth is neutral.
That makes perfect sense.
Or look at the concept of kalala.
Kalala, meaning lateral heirs. Like when someone dies leaving neither direct offspring nor parents, but is survived by siblings.
Yeah. Traditional law convoluted this, but Parwez extracts the clear definition. If a deceased individual is kalala and leaves maternal siblings, the text mandates that brothers and sisters share equally in a 1/3 portion.
So they get 1/6 each.
Exactly. Exact 1-to-1 equality. The math proves the 2-to-1 ratio is an economic balancing mechanism triggered by liability, not a permanent marker of biological superiority.
If you're listening to this and trying to absorb all these fractions, don't worry. The main takeaway here is that the entire system is a delicate, interconnected balancing act.
It really is.
Which brings us to a really dark question. What happens to a society that rips out the dynamic engine, the wasiya will, and forces the secondary algorithms, these fixed biological fractions, to do all the heavy lifting?
You get cascading systemic failure. You get a mathematical crisis. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating critiques in Parwez's work, the mathematical impossibility caused by traditional jurisprudence.
I'll break this down slowly. The Quranic system provides an equation. Total estate minus debts minus the customized wasiya will equals the residual estate.
Right.
Then you apply the fractions, the 8s, the 6, the 2/3, to that residual. Parwez argues this equation is mathematically flawless. It always balances. It never wobbles.
But because traditional clerics practically banned the wasiya, capping it and forbidding it for heirs, they removed the primary dynamic variable from the equation.
So they broke the math.
They did. They attempted to apply the fixed fractions to the entire estate from the very beginning.
Let's do the math on that right now. Let's look at the traditional breakdown for a specific scenario.
Imagine someone dies. Under traditional law, without the buffer of the will, the wife gets 1/8 of the entire estate, the two parents get 1/6 each, and two daughters get 2/3.
Wait, hold on. Let me map that out. We have 1/8 plus 1/6 plus 1/6 plus 2/3.
Yeah, try adding that up.
Okay, so a common denominator would be 24. That means the wife's 1/8 becomes 3 parts out of 24. The parents' 1/6 become 4 parts each. So we have a 3 plus 4 plus 4. We are up to 11 parts.
Right.
And the two daughters get 2/3, which is 16 parts out of 24. So 11 parts plus 16 parts is 27.
27 parts out of a 24-part estate.
That's impossible. You can't give away 27 pieces of a 24-piece pie. You are trying to give away 112% of an estate. The math literally breaks.
It does, and to patch this glaring mathematical error, an error resulting entirely from their own removal of the wasiya, traditional human jurists invented something called the rule of all, or compensatory adjustment.
A human patch for a divine law.
Exactly. The lecture defines the rule of all as a semantic and mathematical manipulation, where clerics arbitrarily decrease the divinely allocated shares of the heirs to force the overall equation to equal exactly 1.
So if the math says 27 over 24, they just changed the denominator to 27.
Yeah, effectively shrinking everyone's share. Parwez uses a very specific cultural metaphor to explain how absurd this is. The charpoy, the traditional woven bed.
Oh, wow. So it's basically like trying to force a piece of software to run on an operating system it wasn't built for. The traditionalists broke the code by removing the will, and all is just an endless series of glitchy software patches to keep the system from crashing.
That is a perfect modern equivalent. Parwez equates the cleric's methodology of all to the forced pulling and stretching required to remove the crookedness, the con, from a poorly woven bed.
Ah, I see.
Just as you unevenly stretch and yank the strings to force a crooked bed to sit flat, human jurists are stretching and pulling the divine fractions to force their broken math to work. It is a mockery of the constitutional text.
It totally is.
Parwez points out the logical absurdity. If the divine law specifically mandates exactly a 1/6 share to a dependent, and a jurist arbitrarily subtracts a fraction from it just to fix their own math error, then mathematically the heir is no longer receiving their prescribed 1/6. The Constitution has been violated.
This is what Parwez calls the law of requital, cause and effect. Social physics. If you tamper with the divine algorithm, what is the requital? Like, what is the real-world consequence?
The physical requital of altering this equation is socio-legal paralysis. Parwez maps the concepts of heaven and hell, Jannat and Jahannam, directly to immediate socioeconomic realities on Earth.
Wow, okay.
Hell in these verses isn't just a metaphysical afterlife, it is the terrestrial reality of systemic collapse.
So Jahannam is what we see when the human patch of all makes inheritance so convoluted that it turns into a maze of contradictory legal texts.
Yes. The earthly hell manifests as civil courts permanently clogged with intricate, decades-long property disputes. Assets are frozen by stay orders.
Which we see all the time.
Constantly. Family cohesion is utterly destroyed as siblings battle each other in court over shrinking fractions. And the most tragic requital, destitute widows and orphans dying in poverty while they await litigation, their legal sustenance trapped in a broken human system.
And Jannat, heaven, what does that look like?
Jannat is simply the societal harmony achieved by obeying the unalterable limits, the hudud Allah, established in the text. When the wasiya neutralizes disparity before it starts, civil disputes mathematically vanish.
Courts just empty up.
Completely. Individual selfishness is replaced by universal welfare, and society operates free from fear and grief over resources.
I want to transition to the macro vision here, because we've talked about how the system fixes families. But Parwez argues it goes much, much further than that.
It does.
I want to emphasize what I call the placeholder call-out. For centuries, people have viewed these verses naively, simply as a collection of personal domestic rules, or even just as ritual blessings meant to be read over the deceased. But the rational reality, according to Parwez's extraction, is that this is a constitutional charter. Its purpose is to gradually maneuver society completely away from private ownership.
This is perhaps the most profound revelation in the source material. The inheritance laws we just spent all this time dissecting. Parwez argues they are just a transitional mechanism. They are stepping stones.
Wait, transitional. So the ultimate goal isn't just to divide up estates fairly. Are you saying this ancient text is essentially a blueprint for a post-scarcity economy?
The ultimate objective mapped by the text is a society where surplus wealth, afazil dalat, ceases to exist entirely as private property.
Erasing surplus wealth.
Yes. By legally mandating that wealth be constantly divided, redivided, and scattered among multiple heirs and vulnerable dependents generation after generation, the inheritance system acts as a decentralized algorithm actively preventing capital pooling. It is designed to dismantle concentrated estates.
It's a mechanism to eradicate the concept of mine versus yours. Parwez says the Quranic system seeks to erase this primitive division regarding capital and resources. If wealth is constantly being fractured and redistributed, generational wealth hoarding becomes mathematically impossible.
Exactly. And this requires redefining another foundational term. The mu'min, traditionally translated merely as believer.
Right.
Parwez shifts this from a mere theological label to a functional socioeconomic contract. Citing Surah At-Tawbah, he defines a mu'min as a citizen who explicitly sells their life and personal wealth to the divine state system.
They functionally agree to the eradication of their private property in exchange for absolute institutional security. It's an active civic contract, not just a feeling in your heart.
Precisely.
But how does the state actually collect this wealth if inheritance is constantly giving it to family members?
The ultimate safeguard against stagnant wealth is the concept of Bayt al-Mal, the state treasury. The source notes that if an individual dies without any heirs, a kalala with no siblings, the entirety of their estate does not just sit in limbo or get absorbed by distant wealthy relatives.
Where does it go?
It defaults directly to the Islamic State to be utilized exclusively for Rafa'iyam public welfare.
So if you don't have a family to absorb and circulate your wealth, the state absorbs it to nourish the broader society.
Right.
In Parwez's vision of the finalized Quranic state, the system maneuvers society to a point where no individual holds excess capital. All resources are pooled for universal sustenance. The inheritance laws are essentially the training wheels, decentralizing wealth until society evolves to voluntarily surrender surplus capital, eliminating class divisions entirely.
It replaces individual economic anxiety with absolute institutional security. When personal estates are removed, the root causes of litigation, civil friction, and violence mathematically vanish. Human energy previously wasted on competitive hoarding is redirected toward productive, peaceful labor.
This has been an incredible journey. Let's synthesize the core permanent value, or mustaqil qadar, established in this deep dive.
Let's do it.
Based on Allama Parwez's extraction, the Quranic system of inheritance and wasiya isn't about micromanaging who gets your couch or your bank account. It is about establishing a universal state system where human dignity is paramount, where basic needs are structurally guaranteed, and where the violent social frictions caused by private capital accumulation are methodically eliminated.
The permanent value is the unwavering commitment to dynamic equity and the protection of the vulnerable, achieved not through human guesswork or glitchy legal patches, but through a flawless, integrated socioeconomic equation.
Take a moment to reflect on the endless property disputes, the legal battles between siblings, and the crushing economic anxieties of our modern world. Consider how a system of dynamic needs-based equity, one that prioritizes a destitute grandchild over a wealthy heir, one that eliminates the pooling of dead capital, might actually solve the root causes of our civil friction.
It's profound to think about.
Think about what our society would look like if our legal codes viewed financial provision not as a mark of biological superiority, but strictly as an administrative liability to ensure universal nourishment.
It certainly reframes the conversation entirely, moving it from the realm of ancient theology into the urgent arena of modern socioeconomic engineering.
But this raises an enormous hanging question. We've seen how this system protects the individual. We've seen the math. We've seen the transitional tools.
We have.
But how does the Quran define the authority, the markaz, that must actually execute this power, collect the surplus wealth, and enforce these rights? If the state is the guarantor of all this, who runs the state? That's where we go in the next lecture.
The mechanisms of enforcement are just as revolutionary as the mechanisms of distribution.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning assumptions, keep digging into the sources, and remember, next time you look at a supposedly rigid ancient text, ask yourself if you're just looking at a crooked bed that human hands have stretched out of shape. Until next time.